A coach stands at a podium and tells the world she rides with her players 10 toes down, no exceptions, no matter what anyone else says. The speech sounds genuine. It sounds passionate. It sounds like someone drawing a hard line in defense of her entire roster. But here's the problem. That same coach had just spent days protecting a player from the opposing team over her own injured athlete wearing the same jersey. The moment that contradiction got exposed through sideline footage and frame-by-frame video breakdowns, the narrative collapsed. What started as a bad post-game comment became a much bigger question about where loyalty actually sits inside a professional locker room, and whether a coaching relationship from years earlier should ever outweigh standing up for the player sitting on your own bench in pain. This is the story of how Stephanie White's carefully constructed defense fell apart the moment anyone actually looked at the footage. Patrick Bet-David didn't waste any time the moment the full picture came into view. He pulled up the footage, looked straight into the camera, and said what a lot of people were already thinking, but weren't sure how to articulate. Here was a coach standing at a microphone telling everyone watching that she leads with love, grace, humility, and integrity. She rides with her players no matter what. Everybody else can go to hell. Those are strong words. Those are the words of someone making a statement about where her priorities sit and who she's willing to defend unconditionally. Except the moment anyone actually looked at what happened on the court and what she said about it, the whole thing stopped making sense. This wasn't about a coach making a simple mistake or fumbling her words once under pressure. This was about watching someone's story change in real time as the outside pressure mounted. And that shift, tracked step by step from the initial incident all the way through her final statement, is what actually tells the real story. It's not what happened on the court that matters most. It's how she responded to it, when she responded to it, and most importantly, how her response kept changing depending on what the internet was saying at any given moment. The internet noticed, fans noticed, other analysts noticed, and once you saw the side-by-side comparison of what the footage actually showed versus what she claimed happened, it became genuinely difficult to watch that comparison and walk away thinking she was telling the truth about any of it. Her eyes were locked on the play when it happened. You could see it clear as day from the sideline camera. She wasn't looking at a clipboard. She wasn't turned toward an assistant coach having a conversation. She was facing straight at the court with a direct line of sight to the exact spot where the foul occurred. That detail matters because everything that came after it hinged on whether she actually saw what happened in real time or whether she missed it, and only understood it later when she watched the replay. The problem is that her initial post-game comments showed the confidence of someone who had watched the play develop live. She didn't express uncertainty. She didn't say things like, "I need to see that again," or "I want to know more about what happened there." Instead, she came out with specific details about Carrington's intent and competitive nature. She said she didn't think the contact was intentional. She defended the hard foul itself as something she doesn't oppose. That's not the language of someone who missed a play. That's the language of someone who saw it, processed it, and made a deliberate choice about how to frame it publicly. And then the backlash started building. It came from fans. It came from analysts on national television. It came from people online breaking down the footage frame by frame and asking the same question over and over. How does a flagrant 2 that visibly injures a player get described by that player's own coach as something she doesn't oppose? The louder the criticism grew, the more pressure built on Stephanie White to say something different than what she'd already said on camera. That mounting pressure directly explains what happened only a few days later, when White suddenly changed her entire story in front of a completely different set of cameras and a completely different tone. This time, she said she didn't actually see the play develop in real time. She explained that she went straight from the bench to a scheduled press conference and only afterward, once she watched it on replay, realized how egregious it looked. That's a convenient explanation. It's also directly contradicted by the sideline footage everyone rewatched. She's looking right at the court when the contact happens. There's no ambiguity in the footage. There's no moment where you could reasonably say she was turned away or distracted. She's watching it live just like everyone else in that arena was watching it live. So you're left with a choice. Either she saw the play in real time and lied about not seeing it 3 days later, or she didn't see the play and she was lying about the details of what she saw when she made her initial post-game comments. There's no third option where both stories are true. The two accounts are fundamentally incompatible with each other. You can't simultaneously have watched something live and called out specific details about it while also claiming you didn't see it happen until you watched it on replay days later. That contradiction is the heart of why this story didn't fade away quietly like she probably hoped it would. What makes it worse is the way she framed her final statement. She didn't apologize for being wrong about not seeing the play. She didn't acknowledge that her initial comments had been misleading. Instead, she took it personally when people suggested she doesn't have her players' backs. She insisted she rides with every one of them, no exceptions. She talked about how she leads with love and grace and humility and integrity. She made the entire thing about her feelings and her character instead of addressing the actual contradiction in what she'd said. That's the moment that really lit the fuse online. That's the moment when people stopped trying to be charitable about what happened and started asking harder questions about why a coach would change her story so dramatically, and why she would frame getting called out for that contradiction as an attack on her character, rather than addressing the actual facts. The play itself happened in a moment. DiJonai Carrington went up for what looked like a legitimate block attempt on Sophie Cunningham. From that moment to the contact landing, there was maybe a second of elapsed time. But in that second, instead of getting her hands on the ball, Carrington's arm came across Cunningham's neck. The contact was hard enough that Cunningham dropped immediately to the floor. She didn't stay down for a second and pop back up. She went down and needed to be checked on by trainers right there courtside. Nobody in that arena needed a slow-motion replay to understand that something had gone wrong. The referees didn't hesitate either. They ruled it a flagrant 2 on the spot. That's the most severe foul you can commit in basketball without it being a technical for something else entirely. It's the kind of foul that results in immediate ejection. Carrington didn't argue about it. She didn't storm off the court making a scene. She picked up her stuff and left because the call was clear enough that even arguing would have been pointless. The broadcast even finished replaying the hit from a second angle before the next play even started, which meant everyone watching at home saw exactly what everyone in the arena had just seen. But here's the detail that matters for understanding everything that comes after this moment. Stephanie White watched it happen. She was standing on the sideline coaching her own team. Sophie Cunningham is her player. Cunningham wears the same jersey that White designed plays for. Cunningham runs the same offensive sets that White drew up in practice. Cunningham is part of the roster that White is directly responsible for protecting and developing. And when DiJonai Carrington caught her across the neck, White was positioned perfectly to see the entire thing unfold from start to finish. If you watch Stephanie White's face on the sideline during the exact second it happens, her eyes are locked on the play. This isn't a situation where a coach is looking down at a clipboard doing administrative work during the game. This isn't a situation where she's turned toward an assistant coach having a conversation about strategy. She's watching it live. Her head position doesn't move. Her eyes track the entire sequence from the moment Carrington goes up for the block to the moment contact lands on Cunningham's neck. Whatever she saw happen on that court, she saw it exactly as it happened in real time, not 3 days later on a highlight reel. The immediate reaction from the arena was audible. Fans sitting courtside were visibly upset the moment the Jumbotron replayed the hit. The energy shifted. People weren't there to watch a flagrant 2 that would result in an ejection. They were there to watch basketball. But when someone gets hit hard enough to drop to the floor and needs medical attention, the mood changes. The crowd knew something bad had just happened. The replays confirmed it. And Stephanie White, standing right there on the sideline, knew it too. What happened next is where this story becomes important for understanding the bigger picture. White walked past Sophie Cunningham, her own player who was just struck hard enough to need trainer attention, to check on DiJonai Carrington. Now, coaches move around during games. Coaches make decisions about who to talk to and when to talk to them. But that particular choice to walk past an injured teammate to check on the opposing player who just hit that teammate is the kind of moment that sticks with people. It's the kind of moment that players in that locker room notice. It's the kind of moment that tells you something about where a coach's priorities sit in a given moment. The clips of the hit spread across every platform within hours after the game ended. By the next morning, millions of people had seen the play from multiple angles. Analysts started asking the same question on repeat across every sports network that covers women's basketball. How does a flagrant 2 that visibly injures a player get described by that player's own coach as something she doesn't oppose? The question seemed simple enough. It seemed like something that shouldn't even need asking, because the answer should have been obvious. But it became the central question of this entire story, because the answer Stephanie White had already given didn't match what everyone had just watched. The reaction wasn't quiet. It wasn't a small subset of the fan base. It was widespread and it was immediate. People online were breaking down the contact, analyzing the contact, questioning the contact. Sports media was covering it. Current and former players were commenting on it. The conversation wasn't about whether the foul was bad. Everyone agreed the foul was bad. The conversation was about why the head coach of the injured player hadn't immediately said so. Right after the final buzzer sounded and the game ended, reporters asked Stephanie White about the foul. They didn't ambush her with a gotcha question or try to trap her into saying something controversial. They asked her a straightforward question about what happened on the court during the game she just coached. And she didn't hesitate. She had an answer ready. That matters because it tells you her initial response came from instinct, not from something she had time to think through and carefully construct. She said that DiJonai Carrington is going to play her heart out every single night. She said that nobody is going to walk in for an easy layup against her because of how hard Carrington competes. And then she added something that shifted the entire tone of her answer. She said that she personally doesn't oppose the hard foul. That's a specific choice of words. She's not saying she thinks the foul was clean. She's not saying she thinks it was a good play. She's saying she doesn't oppose hard fouls in general, and she's connecting that general statement directly to what Carrington just did to Cunningham. She even said she didn't think Carrington intentionally went for the neck. That's a detail that matters because it shows she's already made a judgment about Carrington's intent. She's already decided that the contact was incidental rather than deliberate. She's already processed what happened and come to a conclusion that minimizes what actually occurred. She's not expressing uncertainty about what she witnessed. She's expressing confidence in her interpretation of what she witnessed. And here's the key thing about that initial post-game response. That's not the response of a coach who missed the play. A coach who genuinely didn't see something develop in real time would naturally lean toward uncertainty when asked about it. She would say something like, "I didn't get a great angle from the sideline," or "I want to see the replay before I comment too much," or "That's going to be up to the referees to decide." Those are the kinds of things coaches say when they don't have a clear view of something that just happened. Instead, White came out with specific details about Carrington's competitive nature and intent. She came out with a general statement about not opposing hard fouls. She came out defending the player who just committed the flagrant foul against her own injured athlete. That's the response of someone who saw what happened, processed it immediately, and made a deliberate choice about how to frame it publicly. She decided in that moment that the right approach was to defend Carrington rather than immediately acknowledge how bad the contact looked. The confidence in those post-game comments is actually the thing that makes the later explanation so problematic. If she genuinely hadn't seen the play develop in real time, her immediate post-game comments should have reflected that uncertainty. But they didn't. They reflected the confidence of someone who had watched something happen and made quick judgments about what they saw. That consistency in her post-game tone is actually what makes the later shift so jarring and so obviously inconsistent with what she claimed happened. Within hours, her initial post-game comments were everywhere. They were being shared on social media. They were being discussed on sports network shows. They were being analyzed and broken down by people trying to understand how a coach could watch a flagrant foul happen to her own player and decide that the right move was to defend the player who committed it rather than immediately express concern for the player who was hurt. The reaction to that post-game press conference was immediate, and it wasn't quiet. Fans who had been sitting in the arena during the game saw the replay and heard her comments and were audibly upset about both things. Players around the league were seeing the clips and commenting on them. Analysts were already starting to ask questions about the contradiction between what happened on the court and what the coach was saying about it publicly. You could feel the momentum building toward something bigger. The initial play was bad. The initial response to the initial play was worse. And the combination of the two things together started creating a story that wasn't going to go away quietly just because the game had ended. Stephanie White had made a choice about how to respond in that moment right after the game. And that choice was about to become the central focus of a much larger conversation about loyalty and coaching priorities, and whether a relationship built with one player should ever outweigh standing up for another player wearing your own jersey. 3 days passed. 3 days of mounting pressure. 3 days of the story not going away. 3 days of analysts and fans and social media continuing to discuss what happened and what White had said about it. 3 days of her own players presumably talking about it in private conversations and locker room settings. And then, on day 4, Stephanie White showed up at another podium with a completely different story. This time, she said she didn't actually see the play develop in real time. This time, she explained that she went straight from the bench to a scheduled press conference, and only afterward, once she watched it on replay, realized how egregious it looked. The shift in her explanation was dramatic. On day 1, she was confident enough to make specific claims about Carrington's intent and competitive nature. On day 4, she was claiming she didn't actually see the play at all until she watched it later. She said she takes it personally when people suggest she doesn't have her players' backs. She insisted she rides with them 10 toes down all the time, every single time. She said they know that about her. She said it's a shame that the focus has been on this foul instead of on the great basketball her team has been playing. And then she raised her voice and told everyone in the room and everyone watching from home that she stands by her players no matter what. That she rides with them regardless of what anybody else outside that locker room has to say about it. It sounded genuinely passionate. It sounded like a coach drawing a hard line in defense of her entire roster against outside noise. It sounded like someone who had listened to the criticism and decided to respond by doubling down on her commitment to her players. The tone was different from day 1. The framing was different. The energy was different. On day 1, she had been matter-of-fact about defending Carrington. On day 4, she was emotional about the idea that anyone would suggest she doesn't stand by her players. But here's the problem with that explanation. Sideline footage from the original broadcast clearly shows her looking directly at the play as it happens. She's not turned away. She's not distracted by a substitution. She's not looking at her notes or talking to an assistant coach. She's facing straight at the court with a clear line of sight to the exact spot the foul occurred. Every detail points to someone watching the play develop in real time, not someone who missed it and only understood it later. And that detail matters, because it means her initial post-game comments make a lot more sense if she actually saw what happened. If she had genuinely missed the play, her post-game comments should have been vague and uncertain. Instead, they were specific and confident. She knew enough to make claims about Carrington's intent. She knew enough to frame it as a hard foul she doesn't oppose. She knew enough to add context about Carrington's competitive style. That's not the knowledge base of someone who missed a play. That's the knowledge base of someone who watched it and processed it and decided how to talk about it publicly. So now you're left with a situation where her story has changed in a way that's directly contradicted by the footage everyone can watch. She said she didn't see it in real time. The footage shows her watching it in real time. One of those things has to be untrue. Either she saw it and lied about not seeing it, or she didn't see it and lied about the details of what she saw when she made her initial comments. There's no way to make both stories true. They're fundamentally incompatible with each other. The moment people started rewatching that sideline angle side by side with her new explanation, the story stopped adding up. Commentators who had already been skeptical of her post-game comments used this moment as proof that their concerns weren't overblown. If she claimed she didn't see the play but the footage showed her watching it, then everything else she had said about the incident became questionable. If she would change that fundamental detail, what else might she be misrepresenting? The comparison clips started circulating online. Someone would pull the original sideline footage and put it right next to her later press conference quote, breaking it down frame by frame. It became genuinely difficult to watch that comparison and walk away thinking she truly missed the play. Her head doesn't move in a way that would suggest she's looking away from the court. Her eyes track the entire play from start to finish. The way her body is positioned shows someone paying close attention to what's happening on the court in front of her. What made it worse is that she had actually implied she had a better view than some of the referees. She was talking about how Carrington plays hard and how she doesn't oppose the foul, language that comes from someone who watched it develop. Then, when the pressure mounted and she needed a new explanation, she suddenly couldn't see it. The inconsistency was too stark, and once people noticed it, it became impossible to ignore. The proof was right there on camera the entire time. Nobody had to speculate about whether Stephanie White was watching the play or not. The broadcast captured her face, her eyes, her body language in that exact moment when the contact happened. All anyone had to do was look at the footage and pay attention to what they were seeing. And when Patrick Bet-David and other analysts started pulling up that footage and breaking it down, the narrative that White had constructed started falling apart. Her eyes are locked on the play when it happens. That's the detail that jumps out immediately when you watch the footage. You can see her head position. You can see where her gaze is directed. She's not looking down at anything. She's not turned toward a sideline conversation. She's watching the court. When Carrington goes up for what looks like a block attempt, White's eyes track it. When the contact happens, her eyes are on that contact. When Cunningham drops to the floor, White sees Cunningham drop to the floor because her eyes are already tracking that area of the court. A coach's instinct in a moment like that is to immediately process what just happened. White's face might show concern or surprise or realization depending on what she's watching, but that facial expression would be the response to watching something happen in real time, not the response to hearing someone tell her about something that happened. The micro-expressions, the eye movement, the way her body reacts to the contact, all of it shows someone receiving information visually in that moment, not someone learning about something after the fact. You can even see the moment her brain processes that this is a bad foul. You can watch the shift in her expression as she realizes how hard the contact was and how much Cunningham is affected by it. That's not the look of someone who didn't see it. That's the look of someone who watched it happen and is immediately understanding the severity of what just occurred. The footage captures all of that in real time. The comparison videos that started circulating online made this even clearer. Someone would take the original sideline angle from the broadcast and cut it right next to a clip of Stephanie White saying, "I didn't see the play in real time." And then they would slow it down frame by frame so you could watch her eyes and her head position in slow motion while hearing her claim that she didn't actually see what was happening. The contrast between what the footage showed and what she was claiming became impossible to reconcile. Multiple analysts pulled up that same footage and broke it down the exact same way. They would pause it at different moments in the sequence to show Stephanie White's line of sight, her eye position, her body angle, everything that would be required to actually watch the play develop in real time. Every single one of them came to the same conclusion. She was watching it. There's no way to look at that footage and come away believing she missed it. What made the situation worse is that White had reportedly been told about this footage before she gave her second press conference. She had been made aware that sideline footage existed that contradicted her claim about not seeing the play in real time. And she still went ahead and gave that explanation anyway. She still stood at the podium and told everyone she didn't see it live. She still insisted that she only understood how bad it was once she watched the replay. That choice to give an explanation that she likely knew was contradicted by available footage is what really escalated the story into something bigger than just a coach saying something off the cuff. This became a situation where someone was actively misrepresenting what happened, not just missing the play or misremembering the details of what occurred. This became a situation where the person at the center of the controversy was choosing to tell a story that didn't match the documentary evidence everyone else could watch. The pressure this created was intense. Commentators weren't just questioning her judgment or her response to the foul anymore. They were questioning whether she was being honest about fundamental facts that could be verified by video footage. And once you lose that level of credibility, it becomes very difficult to earn it back with just words. You need to actually address the contradiction in a direct and honest way. But that's not what happened. Instead of acknowledging that her story didn't match the footage, White doubled down on the narrative about standing by her players and leading with grace and love and humility. She made the conversation about her character and her values rather than addressing the actual contradiction in what she had claimed. That choice to avoid the core issue directly is what kept the story alive long after it might have otherwise faded away. The footage was irrefutable. Anyone who wanted to could pull it up and watch it themselves. They didn't have to take anyone's word for it. They didn't have to trust an analyst's interpretation or accept a commentator's conclusion. The evidence was right there in the original broadcast for anyone who wanted to look at it. And the more people looked at it, the more obvious it became that Stephanie White's explanation about not seeing the play in real time didn't match what the cameras had captured. Just days after the Cunningham incident, DiJonai Carrington was back on the court guarding a different opponent. Cecilia Zandalicini of the Golden State Valkyries had the ball, and Carrington was defending her. The possession developed the same way the earlier one against Cunningham had developed. Carrington reached for the basketball. Zandalicini was trying to make a move, and instead of hand and ball coming together, Carrington's arm came across Zandalicini's face. No flagrant was called, no technical either. But the clip spread across social media almost instantly because it looked eerily similar to what had just happened days earlier against Cunningham. Another play where the contact landed on an opponent's face instead of the ball. The positioning was different. The opponent was different. The game situation was different, but the fundamental pattern of the play was identical. A reaching motion that ended up making contact above the shoulders instead of directly on the ball. One isolated incident can reasonably be called an accident. Two nearly identical incidents that happen days apart against completely different opponents start to look like a pattern worth actually examining instead of quietly excusing away. And that's exactly what analysts and fans started doing the moment the second clip started spreading online. People went back and compared the two plays side by side. They looked at the contact point. They looked at the arm motion. They looked at the outcome. And they started asking whether this was really just a matter of Carrington playing hard or whether there was something else going on. It didn't even stop there. Later in that same matchup against the Valkyries, Carrington also caught Tiffany Hayes across the mouth on another heavily contested possession. That's two separate hits landing on an opponent's face in a single game, stacked directly on top of the flagrant just days earlier against Cunningham. The pattern became impossible to ignore. This wasn't one bad night taken out of context. This was multiple separate plays across multiple separate games and opponents in which the same type of contact kept happening. Commentators who had already been skeptical of White's defense of Carrington used these incidents as proof that their concerns weren't isolated to one bad moment. Patrick Bet-David pulled up footage from earlier in Carrington's career and pointed out similar plays from previous seasons showing a recurring pattern. Hard fouls that repeatedly ended up making contact well above the shoulders instead of clean plays directly on the ball. The track record was extensive. This wasn't a new development. This was a pattern that had been happening for years. When you go back further into Carrington's entire career, you find an entire trail of clips from previous seasons showing the same recurring theme. Plays where the contact made by Carrington landed on an opponent's face or neck area instead of clean contact on the ball. Some of them resulted in fouls. Some of them didn't. But the pattern was consistent enough that it became fair to ask whether this is just aggressive defense or whether it's something that needs to be addressed more seriously. And that's where Stephanie White's original defense of Carrington, framing it all as she plays harder to take at face value. If this were one aggressive defender having a rough week, it would be easy to move past it. You would say that Carrington played too hard one night, that contact was made that shouldn't have been, that the referees called it correctly, and then you would move on to the next game. But when the same type of dangerous play keeps resurfacing across multiple games and opponents over multiple seasons, it stops being a coincidence and starts becoming a habit that somebody with real authority over that player should address directly. The moment the second incident happened and spread online, commentators immediately started connecting it back to the Cunningham foul and to White's response to the Cunningham foul. If White had immediately called the Cunningham foul dangerous and unacceptable, it would have set a tone about what kind of contact is and isn't acceptable. It would have sent a message to Carrington that no matter how hard she plays or how much she competes, certain kinds of contact are off limits. But White didn't do that. She defended the foul instead. And 3 days later, before anyone had really moved on from that incident, Carrington did something similar. The question became whether White's failure to immediately shut down that behavior had any impact on what happened next. Did Carrington feel comfortable playing the same way in the very next game because her former coach had publicly defended her behavior? There's no way to know for certain what's in someone's head, but the timing of the incidents and the consistency of White's response created a narrative that looked like tacit permission from someone in a position of authority. What made it worse is that White kept using the exact same defense for every incident. Every time Carrington was involved in another hard foul or face contact, White would point to how hard she plays and how much she competes. The explanation became so repetitive that it started feeling less like an actual response to individual incidents and more like a blanket justification for any contact Carrington made. And that blanket justification, coming from a coach who had previously coached Carrington and presumably knew her personally, looked less like honest analysis of what happened and more like protection of a player she still felt connected to. Not everyone in the Indiana Fever locker room reacted the same way to what was happening with Stephanie White. That split reaction is important because it tells you something about how complicated this situation really was and how it exposed genuine disagreements within the organization about loyalty and priorities. Caitlin Clark, the most high-profile player on the roster and someone who would carry significant weight in a locker room, publicly stood up for her head coach after White faced heavy backlash from fans and media members over her comments about the Cunningham foul. Clark went on record saying that White is great with all of them and that the real problem is the outside noise trying to distract the team. She said she had talked to White before speaking to the media and that she understood White's perspective. She acknowledged that sometimes the job is hard and sometimes criticism gets to you, but that she had empathy for White's position. That public support from your most important player matters in a situation like this. It sends a message that at least some people in the locker room understand where the coach is coming from and aren't turned against her because of the controversy. It suggests that there are players who value the relationship they have with White, or who genuinely believe that her response to Carrington was justified, or who at least don't think it's worth making a bigger deal out of. That kind of support from someone with Clark's profile can significantly impact the narrative around a coach who's under fire. But Clark's response wasn't universal. Not everyone in that locker room felt the same way about what White had done. Some players were reportedly upset about watching their head coach downplay a hit that put a teammate flat on the floor on national television. Imagine being Sophie Cunningham. Imagine getting hit hard enough to need medical attention. Imagine watching your head coach go on national television and say the hit wasn't intentional and that she doesn't oppose hard fouls. Imagine hearing that from someone who's supposed to have your back and protect you. Cunningham herself didn't stay quiet about it either. She called the foul intentional in her own post-game comments, describing how it felt to get hit that hard and stressing she didn't believe it was incidental contact. That direct contradiction between what Cunningham said and what her own coach initially said only added another layer to the controversy. When the player who got hurt tells a different version of events than the coach standing a few feet away, fans have to decide who to trust. And most fans are going to trust the person who absorbed the hit over the one offering damage control days later. The split in the locker room became even more apparent when other players started speaking to the media about the situation. Some emphasized that they weren't losing this game for Stephanie White. Some talked about her leadership and her commitment to them. Others seemed less enthusiastic in their comments, focusing more on the basketball itself than on defending White's response to the foul. That variation in how players talked about the situation revealed genuine fissures within the team about how to feel about what their head coach had done. Henry Ellenson, one of the veteran players, offered what seemed like the most nuanced take from inside the locker room. She acknowledged that White is human and that sometimes things get hard and sometimes emotions bubble up. She said she had been through similar situations and that you can have thick skin, but sometimes criticism still gets to you. She defended White while also acknowledging the legitimate criticism the coach had faced. It was a way of saying White made a mistake without saying White is a bad person or a bad coach. But that kind of measured response from a veteran player doesn't eliminate the underlying tension. The fact that you need a veteran to come out and explain that the head coach is human and sometimes makes mistakes under pressure is itself an indication that the situation is complicated and that not everyone in the locker room is on the same page about how to feel about what happened. The real tension running underneath all of this is about priorities and loyalty. White had framed her post-game comments about Carrington as an example of standing by her players. She had talked about riding with them 10 toes down. But the players who were in that locker room had to reconcile that framing with the reality that their head coach seemed to be prioritizing a relationship with a player on a different team over immediately standing up for a teammate who had been hurt. That disconnect between what White was saying about loyalty and what her actions seemed to demonstrate about loyalty is what created the split reaction. Some players, like Clark, chose to interpret White's response as genuine competitive respect for another hard-playing athlete. Some players, implied but not explicitly stated, had a harder time reconciling that interpretation with what they had witnessed. The locker room split reflected a genuine disagreement about whether White had made a mistake in her prioritization or whether she had done the right thing by supporting a fellow competitor. And that kind of split in opinion from within the team is exactly the kind of thing that can create long-term problems if it isn't addressed directly and honestly. This entire story comes down to one fundamental question that goes way beyond the specific foul or the specific players involved. It's a question about where loyalty is supposed to sit inside a professional locker room and whether a coaching relationship built years earlier with a rival player should ever outweigh standing up for the player wearing your own jersey and sitting on your own bench in pain. None of this requires assuming the worst about Stephanie White as a person. Coaches build real relationships over years. When you coach somebody for a full season, you build trust. You learn how they think. You understand what makes them tick as a competitor. You invest in their development. Those relationships shape how people react under sudden pressure, often without them realizing it. White coached DiJonai Carrington in Connecticut for 2 full seasons before either one of them ended up where they are today. That's not a small detail, and it's not something fans invented to manufacture drama. That relationship is real. So when the play happened right in front of her, and White's first instinct was to frame it as Carrington simply playing hard rather than calling it exactly what everyone else saw, that reaction lines up with someone protecting a player she still feels connected to, not a neutral coach evaluating a dangerous play against her own injured athlete. The human element matters here. It's reasonable to understand why she might have that instinct. It's much harder to defend why that instinct should take priority over loyalty to Cunningham. Because that's what this really comes down to. When White talked about riding with her players 10 toes down and standing by them no matter what, she presumably meant all of them, not just the ones she used to coach at a previous job. Cunningham wears the same jersey. Cunningham is on the same roster. Cunningham is in the same locker room. Cunningham is under the same head coach every single day at practice. If loyalty is supposed to run in both directions equally, then that same passionate energy about standing by your players should have shown up the moment Cunningham needed her own coach to say the hit looked exactly as bad as it did. Instead, the benefit of the doubt went to the player White used to coach. The player actually on the receiving end of the hit had to wait days before her own head coach even acknowledged how bad it truly looked. And even then, it took public pressure and mounting criticism to force that acknowledgement. Without the backlash, Cunningham would still be waiting for her own head coach to immediately say what happened to her was wrong. That asymmetry is what really damaged White's credibility. It's not about whether White is a good person. It's about whether her actions matched what she was saying about her commitment to her players. The words said one thing, the actions said something different. Cunningham got hurt on the court by a player wearing a different uniform. The natural response of a coach who's standing right there watching it happen is to immediately express concern for your own player and to call out the dangerous play. That's not a complicated thing. That's not something that should require 3 days of thinking about or a press conference to figure out. White saying she stands by her players no matter what sounds strong at a podium. But standing by all of them equally, including the one who got hurt, is very different from quietly picking a side and hoping nobody notices. And the way she picked her side, in real time, while watching it happen, tells you where her instinct pointed when she didn't have time to think about the optics or the message she was sending. That instinct revealed that her relationship with Carrington felt more important to her, in that moment, than her responsibility to Cunningham. That's not something you fix with another carefully worded statement 3 days after the fact. That's not something you fix by talking about grace and love and humility at a press conference. That's something you fix by addressing it directly and honestly, by acknowledging that you made a choice in that moment that you would make differently now, by explaining that you understand how your response made Cunningham feel and committing that you won't make that mistake again. Until Stephanie White does that, until she addresses that specific contradiction directly and clearly instead of offering another carefully worded statement, this story is going to keep resurfacing every single time DiJonai Carrington ends up in another headline for the exact same reason. Every time that pattern repeats itself, every time that same type of dangerous contact happens again, people are going to look back at how White responded the first time, and they're going to remember that she didn't immediately shut it down. They're going to remember that she defended it instead. And they're going to wonder whether her failure to set a clear boundary in that first moment had any impact on what happened next. This story reveals something real about how relationships and history shape decision-making in high-pressure moments. It's a reminder that coaches are human and that personal connections influence how we react to situations. But it's also a reminder that being human doesn't absolve you of the responsibility to treat everyone in your care with equal commitment to their safety and their development. Stephanie White stood at multiple podiums and told the world that she leads with love, grace, and integrity. She talked about riding with her players 10 toes down, no exceptions. But the sideline footage showed her watching the play happen in real time. Her initial post-game comments showed confidence about Carrington's intent. Her changed story contradicted the documentary evidence everyone could watch, and the pattern of similar incidents kept resurfacing. This wasn't about one coach saying one careless thing at one press conference. It was a referendum on where loyalty actually sits inside a locker room and whether a coaching relationship built years earlier with a rival player should outweigh standing up for the player sitting on your own bench in pain. The world watched as Stephanie White's carefully constructed defense fell apart the moment anyone looked at the footage. And the question she still hasn't answered directly is why that relationship mattered more than the player who got hurt.